But I'm doing 10 to 20 in the frozen granite state. And every day I go to work to stamp out license plates. Well, every day I go to work, and every night I cry, 'cause every license plate I make tells me to live free or die. Well, live free or die, oh Lord, tell me why can't they say seatbelts fastened or Oklahoma is okay? Vacation land sounds mighty great. I wouldn't mind stamping out the Garden State. It's enough to make me cry. Well, live free or die.
Ohio say seatbelts fastened. Oklahoma's okay. And you know what Idaho's plates say? Famous potatoes. This is my plate from the state of Alaska. I used to get a kick out of driving the lower 48 with this picture of a menacing brown bear. And then Alaska put a slogan on its plates, "The Last Frontier." Now that's a statement. It used to be that New Hampshire's plates belonged in this category of mild-mannered ones, until Robert Lawton sat at his dining room table one night. Now Lawton was a state representative of Meredith, and scenic New Hampshire wasn't good enough for him. He wanted a slogan that would characterize the state's independent spirit. He wanted to make a statement. And 8 years after this license plate was born at a dining room table, it became the subject of argument before the justices of the Supreme Court of the United States.
The case started as an idea that I had when I was campaigning. I believed in the motto, and I just thought it was a great motto. And it had been adopted by our legislature, as I recall, in 1945. So I suggested that to one of my workers, a very fine gentleman by the name of Fred Noyes, that we put it on a bumper sticker and get as many bumper stickers out as we could. And he came up with an improved idea. He said, why don't we put it on the license plate? Well, at that time, there was only one man who was really leading the charge in the legislature as a conservative, and that was Bob Lawton of Meredith.
In 1968, I was elected to my first term in the legislature, and a friend of mine, Fred Noyes, who was then a publisher of the Pittsfield News, suggested to me that it might be possible to put the state motto, "Live Free or Die," on the license plates. So it sounded like a good idea to me. So I went home and I drew up this particular mock plate I have right here, just to see if it would fit, because the first reaction a lot of people had was that it wasn't going to fit on the plate. You wouldn't be able to read it. And then I went to the state prison where the plates were still made at that time, and found that for $91 we could buy a new slug replacing the word scenic. So we could get into this almost for nothing and just substitute the slugs, and we were in business.
It was Representative Lawton's bill in the legislature that put "Live Free or Die" on the license plates. But it was this man who put it in the history books.
Our Revolutionary War hero, General John Stark, who was the leader that won the Battle of Bennington, which was a very important, decisive battle in the beginning of the Revolution. At the 32nd anniversary of that battle, he was invited to attend a ceremony, and he was too ill to attend, so he sent a letter to be read at the ceremony.
By that time, he was approaching 90, and you had to go from Manchester to Bennington by horseback, so he couldn't go. But he wrote a letter to his comrades who were there. And he wound it up with the postscript, which said, "Live free or die. Death is not the worst of evils." And you take the whole thing, and it's very significant. And it's very much like Patrick Henry's, "Give me liberty or give me death." This was a sentiment of those who fought the Revolutionary War. And I think that it's imperative that we understand that our liberty came to us by those who were willing to make that kind of sacrifice for it.
The legislature took "Live Free or Die," part of that sentence, and made it the state motto in 1945 in their wisdom.
That wisdom elevated Stark's words from postscript to state motto. But that didn't make it the motto of everyone in the state. George Maynard didn't want it for his motto, and in the spring of 1974, he covered up the "Live Free or Die" on the license plate of him and his wife Maxine. The Maynards objected on religious grounds. To them, the motto meant a willingness to die for an earthly government. And when the kids in the neighborhood stripped the tape off the plates, George Maynard wouldn't say die. He took one more step, got out his tin snips, and this time he cut out "or die" altogether, leaving the rest of the plate taped over. The kids weren't the only ones to notice Maynard's plates. The police did too. Lebanon, November 1974. They gave him a citation. By covering his plates, Maynard was breaking the law. They took one of his plates for evidence. Neil Woolley was Lebanon's police chief back then, which is why his name is still on the case. Maynard versus Woolley. And today, Woolley still backs up his officer's decision to give Maynard a citation.
It was quite evident that they were not going to remove the tape. There was no personal animosity between us and them. It was a legal issue that arose, and we just treated it strictly as that.
In December 1974, George Maynard represented himself in Lebanon District Court before Judge William Lovejoy, who fined Maynard $25 and suspended the fine.
We already had some similar type case which had been determined, I think, by the Supreme Court previously. It was very evident that the man appeared to be sincere about his convictions of not being obliged to put this on his, remain on his license plate. But the law, as I read it and interpreted, and especially in view of that previous Supreme Court determination, seemed very clear to me that he was in violation.
Lovejoy did not tell Maynard to remove the tape. According to Maynard, the judge told him to go home and behave himself, which is what he thought he did. The Maynards continued to drive with their plates covered until they were stopped again, once more in Lebanon. This time, George ended up at the police station, where he made himself a set of cardboard plates to use on the drive home. The car never made it home. George was stopped by an officer, forced him to leave his car, but did offer him a lift. For the next week, the Maynards drove their other car with the covered plates until those too were confiscated. George hitchhiked to work in January when he appeared before Judge Lovejoy. This time, the judge fined him $50. In order to pay the $25, he'd suspended the first time around. But George told the judge it was against his Christian conscience to pay it.
Of course, I had no real alternative but to commit him. The term itself would have been 1 day's confinement for each $5 a fine, which he refused to pay.
George Maynard would not pay. No way. He was going to end up spending a lot of time here if he continued to refuse, unless he got some legal help. Attorney Jack Middleton.
Dick Cohn, representing the New Hampshire and Vermont Civil Liberties Union, petitioned the Federal District Court for a temporary restraining order. Got a temporary restraining order against further prosecuting George Maynard until the court had a chance to determine whether, in fact, he had some civil rights that were being impacted adversely by this motto on his license plate.
Jack Middleton and I got involved and drafted some pleadings and became involved at that point in time.
That was David Depew, who was one of George Maynard's lawyers. Part of the challenge facing Depew and Jack Middleton was that George Maynard wasn't the first person to wind up in court because he wanted to get the motto off his license plate. In fact, in 1971, someone had even tried to take it out with a hammer.
That was the state of New Hampshire versus two defendants, one by the name of Hoskin and the other by the name of Eli. And those two cases were similar cases in which both the defendants had obliterated the state motto on the license plate, and the cases were consolidated from the district court level and were sent to the New Hampshire Supreme Court and argued there. Our state Supreme Court found that the interests of the state in promoting individualism and in promoting the state were greater than the interests of the two defendants in the license plate.
Assistant Attorney General Robert Johnson was assigned the Maynard case, which was becoming a hot topic.
Freedom of expression, whether it was wearing a saying on a jacket, was much more prevalent at the time that this case was going through the courts. And so it was a hotter issue.
By this time, the Maynard case was beginning to draw the attention of the executive branch of state government. Meldrum Thompson Jr. was governor then, and he had a commitment to that motto and to the case itself.
Well, it's a great state motto, and it's important that people know the background of it. And by giving it more publicity, they find out the background. And I don't know of any more prominent place to carry a message than right on the license plate. That's the best billboard of all.
We were living in an era then when China, the so-called Taiwan, the Republic of China, was thrown out of the Olympics in Canada, and our flag was flown at half-staff by our governor. It was an era in which we were, I guess, particularly conscious about mottos and so forth that seemed to exhibit patriotism. I think the state of New Hampshire felt very strongly that, in the form of the governor anyway, felt very strongly that this was important somehow to the state of New Hampshire.
It perhaps was because Governor Thompson was governor at the time that the case was pursued by the state. But that's not to say that any prior or subsequent governor would not have said to either the Attorney General or myself as Chief of the Criminal Division, this is an important enough matter for us to pursue in the courts. After all, it is the motto of the state of New Hampshire.
Despite the efforts of the executive branch to protect the motto, the judiciary kept supporting the claims of George and Maxine Maynard.
They asked for an injunction that would prevent them from being arrested again, because they had adamantly decided that they were going to cover up the motto on the license plate. So we had a hearing on their request for what we call a preliminary injunction, and I granted the preliminary injunction because I found that there was a probability of a constitutional violation.
The state did raise some issue about their sincerity, but I don't think any of the judges had any concern about the sincerity of their beliefs, since Mr. Maynard has spent 15 days in jail in lieu of paying a $75 fine, and then driven back into Lebanon again and was about to go back to jail again for probably a longer period of time.
This whole case arose during the Vietnam War, and feelings were running high about patriotism and love of country and so forth, and unfortunately sometimes in that instance more heat was engendered than light.
Well, I'm disappointed that...
Meldrum Thompson was never afraid of the heat, and he wasn't going to stand still while anyone got permission to cover up the motto.
I had our state attorney take it to the U.S. Supreme Court.
He made it an issue where it was not really that big an issue, but when he took it to the Supreme Court, when you go to the Supreme Court, that makes it a big issue.
We, being in the Attorney General's office, and I being the chief of the criminal division, had an obligation in the executive branch of the government to defend the laws of the state.
I remember years and years ago, New Hampshire had a motto. It said, "Scenic New Hampshire." And there was a friend of mine that covered that up on the basis that he didn't want to carry something that helped Kodak sell film. And nobody objected to that.
Interestingly enough, we had discovered over in the State Highway building in those days, they had a big billboard with all of the state license plates on them, all the different kinds. And we discovered that it was only private passenger car plates that had this logo on it. Now the state stamps out a license plate for the governor. It didn't say "Live Free or Die" on it. for the United States District Court. It didn't say live free or die on it. The Attorney General didn't say live free or die. And right down the line, it was only you and I, private citizens who drive around with a non-commercial license plate that had this motto on it.
So nearly a year and a half after George Maynard got his first ticket from one of Neil Woolley's officers, the case of Maynard versus Woolley was to be argued by an ACLU lawyer and a state attorney general before the 9 justices of the United States Supreme Court in Washington.
Dick Cohn, who had been the lawyer from the Civil Liberties Union that was involved in the original hearing, and he was the one who got this temporary restraining order originally. Dick had moved to Washington. That's the reason that Dave and I got involved anyway. He became involved again very actively at the appellate level and actually argued the case in the United States Supreme Court. Dave went down to Washington and accompanied him to the Supreme Court.
The court is set up so that there's a bench which isn't very tall and is very close to where you're going to sit and where you're going to stand to argue. And then there are 2 sets of counsel table for plaintiff and defendant. And behind them are another set for plaintiff and defendant. And the Supreme Court doesn't like to be kept waiting, so when the first case gets done arguing, the next group moves up.
It was a wonderful high. It's the dream of any attorney to argue any case before 9 justices of the U.S. Supreme Court.
We were, I think, the second case, so we were sitting in the sort of the second set of seats there when the judges came in. They come in unannounced, all at once, and sort of silently. There were some purple drapes behind the bench, and then there must be steps in back of the bench they sit at. So all of a sudden, all 9 of them appear suddenly in front of you. Very impressive entry, let me tell you. They're very informal. They don't talk about the law a lot. Usually they're talking about just questions that come to mind, and once in a while they'll get on a legal issue, and if it looks like it may be dispositive of the case, then they'll bore right in on that. But usually they're asking just questions that come to mind, like your neighbors might be asking you about the case over the fence, you know. And I remember some of the questions they asked were, who makes the license plates in New Hampshire? And the answer was, inmates at the state prison make them. And they said, well, that motto is kind of ironic for those fellows, isn't it?
In April of 1977, the Supreme Court handed down its ruling. Thank you. In the majority opinion, written by Chief Justice Warren Burger, the Maynard's right to the freedom of expression was protected under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution.
There were 2 issues in the case. One had to do with the rights of the state, or of any state, to enforce the state's own laws and not to have the federal government intervene in that process. And I was not surprised that the United States Supreme Court took the case on that particular issue. As to the secondary issue, but the more popular issue of freedom of expression, I perhaps was a little surprised.
And if Johnson was surprised by that, there were more surprises in store.
When it was appealed by Governor Thompson, within weeks of that, the Congress passed a new law, the Civil Rights Attorneys Fee Act of whatever the year was, 1976, I think, that provided for attorneys to be paid in these civil rights cases if they were successful. So we took it up, and we were successful again in the Supreme Court, so we applied for fees, and Judge Bounds awarded us some amount of fees, and the state, let's say, hesitated at paying. And we pressed them, and we were told, well, when the Governing Council meets the next time, they'll approve them, and time went on. We didn't get paid, so we applied to the court for an order that they be paid and the writ of execution.
Well, at that point, the question is, where do you get money from the state of New Hampshire? I certainly, having been a legislator for 8 years and been involved in the state of New Hampshire, knew that the treasurer didn't keep $27,000 in his safe, and the question was, where do you get it? And one of the lines in the writ of execution said to take the liquid assets of the state of New Hampshire. Well, I can think of no better place to take liquid assets than the state liquor store. And so the decision was made at that time for us to go to the liquor store. So I took 3 deputies with me, and we left for the Hooksett toll gate on the northern bound lane, and stopped in there and came in with the writ of execution. And there was a kind of an elderly gentleman, a really nice man, who was in charge of the store. And I said, "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you, but I'd like to tell you that the federal government is in fact taking money from the state of New Hampshire, and we will be cleaning out the cash registers very shortly." And his reaction was that, first of all, he almost passed out. That was number one. Number two, he said, "You really can't do that." And I said, "Yes, I can. I have a federal court order, and I'm going to take the monies that are owed the state of New Hampshire, and if I can't get enough cash, we may be forced to take liquor and have an actual auction in order to pay the monies owed to the attorneys in this particular case."
And he called me from the toll booth up there in Hooksett, I think, or the liquor store was right next to the toll booth then, and said, "I'm up here, but Bob Johnson would like to talk to you. Would you delay the writ of execution?" And he says, "I can go ahead and get the money." He says, "I feel a little nervous about it. Somebody may think we're, trying to hold up the liquor stores here, because they were going to scoop the money right out of the cash trusts."
I had close friends of mine who ended up as recipients of free room and meal at the state prison in Concord on more than one occasion. And one of them, reading about what I had done in the paper, called me and said that he had tried the same thing 8 years earlier and got 5 to 7.
We got a check within, I think, a few weeks or something. But that was a humorous aspect of the thing, and it shows that, when you do good things, sometimes you're rewarded, right?
So the legislature had passed a law putting the state's motto, "Live free or die," on the license plates. And the executive branch, including the governor and the attorney general, had set out to make the law stick. But in the end, the courts upheld the rights of an individual. And that's the way the system is supposed to work. But that doesn't mean that every individual agrees with it, any more than the Maynards did.
People are allowed to obliterate plates, change them, alter them, then the effectiveness of the plate becomes almost useless.
I'd had the case, I probably would have said differently than was found later in the federal system.
They had, I think they had an absolute right to cover up the motto. It didn't interfere with really the identification of the license plate or anything else. And it was, in a way, it certainly was, as Chief Justice Burger found, an attempt by the New Hampshire legislature to enforce a belief on people and have them subscribe to it.
Maynards had done a good job of preparing their own case in a way of getting evidence, and they didn't sleep on their rights. They were actively trying to protect their rights.
Sort of sad that because they had basically stood up for their rights, they suffered as much as they did. I think the system was good to them in the sense that we did see this case all the way through the United States Supreme Court, and they eventually won, but in the meantime they suffered some severe economic losses, and I'm not sure they've entirely recovered at this point.
I think I feel exactly as Judge Rehnquist, who wrote the dissent, felt. If you can carry on the coins that you carry in your purse or in your pocket the motto, E pluribus unum, or in God we trust, and then they put a penalty, the federal government has put a penalty if the coin is defaced, the motto is defaced on it, why then they can be punished, whoever defaces it, if they're caught in the act. And he wrote a very excellent, brief, dissenting opinion. Now he's the Chief Justice. Maybe we could take the case back and get a better view on it.
Today I feel fairly pleased because the justice who wrote the final, the dissenting decision, essentially upholding almost verbatim my oral and written argument, was Justice Rehnquist, who is now Chief Justice. And so I think he wrote the right opinion and perhaps was elevated because of it.
Now, I'm sure there are a lot of other people in the state of New Hampshire that pay no attention to the motto, live free or die, but just wouldn't be bothered about doing anything about it. That's why I say that people that are extreme in some instances really uncover deep-seated constitutional issues.
I was disappointed in the case, but I haven't heard of anybody else covering up the slogan, "Live Free or Die."
Live free or die, oh Lord, tell me why can't they say seatbelts fastened for Oklahoma is okay? Vacation land sounds mighty great. I wouldn't mind stamping out the Garden State. It's enough to make me cry. Well, live free or die. Oh,